T-Space Architecture Lecture Series. Thank you very much for joining us today for Hamed Khosravi's lecture titled The Ecstasy of the Image, works by Zoe Zenghelis. This is the fifth in a series of 8 public lectures organized by T-Space within the framework of the Architecture Residency program. I am Irini Tsakhelia. I'm a practicing architect and an educator in New York, and I've been involved with T-Space as an instructor for the residency program since 2017, which is when the program started. And for the last 3 years, I'm serving as the director of the educational programming, in addition to instructing our residents who are producing some fantastic works. The theme for the residency this year is light and polychromy. And within that framework, I'm very excited to hear from Hamed what you have to offer in this context. Hannah and I will just take a few moments for introductions while everybody is settling in. I want to briefly introduce T-Space to our new audience and what its mission and programming is. T-Space is a nonprofit organization, and it's an initiative of the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation, located in Rhinebeck, New York, which is where I am joining you from. It focuses on arts, education, design, and ecology. And in addition to the architecture residency program, T-Space organizes what we call the synthesis of the arts events, which support the coming together of the arts, and they include art and architecture exhibitions, poetry readings, music performances that all take place here on the grounds in Rhinebeck. We are very excited to have a show this month by Anne Hamilton, and her exhibition opened this past weekend, and it will run until August 20th. It is titled As After Is Before. Anne gave a lecture just yesterday for the residency program. You can find the video of that recording on our YouTube channel and on our website. Hannah will make sure to also put that information on our chat. We highly encourage you to visit the exhibition in person at T-Space before it ends on August 20th. You can find information about gallery hours and other tours that are organized for the grounds here on our website, and again in the chat. So the lecture today by Hamed, along with other lectures in this series, is part of the architecture residency program, which is a 25-day design intensive. It takes place every July, and it's now in its 7th year. The theme for the residency, as I mentioned before, is light and polychromy. And young professionals and residents and students from the field of art and architecture join us to experiment with design and critical thinking. Our residents this year are joining us from different parts of the world. Isabel, Resika, YP, Yasmin, Michael. Hi, welcome everyone to the panel. I'm very pleased, and I would just end with this note that our residents this year, same as previous years, in fact, are supported with scholarships and are able to join the program completely free of charge. This year, they're also being offered a travel stipend to visit us here in Rhinebeck upon the completion of the program. So I'm very excited to meet you all in person. And that is only possible thanks to the very generous support of donors such as Ellis Jaff and Jeffrey Brown, Steve Pulimud, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, Leica Geosystems, the Al Held Foundation, the Pratt Family Fund, Archive Fine Art Inc., and its affiliates Art Creating Inc. and ACLA, Richard Armstrong, Arlene Shehead, Joan and Martin Cummins, Stan Allen, Marga and Anthony Viscusi, Donna Moylan, and Dr. Ben Chu. We're very, very grateful for your support, and I'm sure all our residents, I can speak on their behalf as well. And we welcome everybody who's joining us today to support the program by very simply texting for architecture to 707070. This is what we are here, what we're gathered for the love of architecture. So that's the word you can type if you like to donate. And again, this information is on the chat. So I'll pass it on to Hannah. Hannah, you can tell us a little bit more about the webinar structure, and then we'll introduce Hamed before we get started. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Irini. And I'll just quickly mention that the structure today will be for Hamed to give us his lecture that'll run approximately 35 to 40 minutes. And we'll have about a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. And I just want to mention that if anyone does have questions or comments to mention in the chat or in the Q&A function, feel free to use that at any time, including the attendees and the residents. You don't need to wait until the end. We can always try and interject as Hamed is giving his presentation, but feel free to ask anything in the chat or the Q&A function at any time, and we welcome all questions and comments. And then I will leave it to Yasmin El Alawi, our resident, to introduce Hamed. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. It is an honor and my great pleasure to welcome Hamed Khosravi to the T-Space Rhinebeck and Stephen Myron Hall Foundation Architecture Series. Hamed Khosravi is an architect, writer, and educator. He graduated from the Faculty of Fine Arts, University of Tehran, and holds his master's in architecture from Iran University of Science and Technology, and postgraduate and master's in urbanism at TU Delft and the Institute University of Venice. Hamed received his PhD in History and Theory of Architecture within the city as a project program at TU Delft. Hamed has been teaching history and theory courses, seminars, and design studios in various schools of architecture. In 2017, Hamed completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam on labor movements and the architecture of the city. Currently, he is a studio lead in Projective Cities, MPhil program, and Diploma Unit Master at the Architectural Association School of Architecture, and teaches as a senior lecturer in History and Theory of Architecture at the London South Bank University. Hamed is co-founder of research collectives, the City as Project and Behemoth Press, based in London and Rotterdam, both active in architectural education and at the PhD and postgraduate levels, as well as research and curatorial projects. Khosravi's projects are exhibited internationally at the Venice Biennale 2014, 2016, and 2018, the Barcelona Architectures Festival, Model 2022, the Sharjah Architecture Triennial 2019, the Oslo Architecture Triennial 2016, the Lisbon Architecture Triennial 2016, and many more. His latest project, a research-based curatorial project of the work of Zoe Zenghelis, was exhibited in London and Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Museum of Art. As a writer, Hamed regularly publishes articles, essays, and books. He is author of Gabriel Guvrikian, The Elusive Modernist, editor and co-author of Tehran, Life Within Walls, co-author of Nasgol Ansariniya, Inquiries into the Present, and Sir Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture, 21st edition, Rituals and Walls, The Architecture of Sacred Space, The City as a Project, Cities to be Tamed, among other titles. Most recently published in his book, Do You Remember How Perfect Everything Was? The Work of Zoe Zenghelis, published by AA Publications in 2022. Thank you so much, Hamed, for joining us today. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Thank you, Hannah and Irini. I'm as you all probably know by now, my name is Hamed Khosravi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone that is joining us here on Zoom. I'm very glad to be with you today as part of 2023 T-Space Residency Lecture Series. Thanks especially to Irini and for the invitation, and Hannah for all the organization and coordinations during the past couple of months. I'm also particularly happy and excited since this recent project that I'm going to talk about today, at least in my thoughts, fits perfectly to the theme of this year's lecture series on light and polychromy. I'm very much looking forward to our discussions around the recent topics and also shared interest after or during the presentation. On that note, what I'm going to mostly talk about today is, of course, our person of interest, Zoe Zenghelis, whom we probably know as one of the co-founders of OMA, Office for Metropolitan Architecture. She actually belongs to a generation of artists whose artistic practice developed during the post-war years in Europe and in particular in the UK, when beyond the aesthetics of common sense, these artists, or more precisely painters, abandoned grand narratives, and refused to serve institutional, social, or political projects. They chose to be, as Frank Auerbach once claimed, sole coherent units. Zenghelis actually stands out within that group of predominantly white and male painters by virtue of her singularly surrealistic gaze, which lends the modernist rationality of the time and her spatial arrangement a kind of melancholic allure. In this painting, Urban Landscape from 1985, Zenghelis animates its seemingly static setting through the conjunction of geometrical forms and colors. The eye moves delicately across the scene, drawn to perplexing shadows cast by a dreamlike light. Urban Landscape that we're seeing in the slide now belongs actually to a tradition of modernist art that has flourished through the ongoing dialogue between performance, film, photography, and paintings. Its clearest expressions elsewhere might be found within the metaphysical interiors of painters like Giorgio Di Chirico or expressionist cinema like the movie Last Year in Marienbad from 1961, or Robert Wiene's The Cabinet of Dr. Cagliari from 1920s. In Zenghelis' paintings, the playful yet iconoclastic combination of visual and mental ecstasy evokes a very particular urban form, one that is perhaps a surreal hybrid of the Aegean landscape of her youth and the metropolitan tectonics of cities such as Paris, Berlin, New York, or London, where she's been living in and working since 1955. There are in fact unique qualities in her work that might be interesting for us today and for this residency, that although share common threads with her generation of post-war modernist painters in Britain, but at the same time branches out and shapes its own distinct artistic framework. We could trace them actually in her own words, as she says, and I quote, "I'm attracted to man-made landscapes within my work because I found them an easier setting in which to express the mysteries of human emotions. On my stage, in the mist, at the down or under the layer of muslin, my geometrical elements dramatize themselves in the diffuse light, mysteriously extenuating the atmosphere and mood." These qualities actually became more vividly evident once Zenghelis' work entered the territory of mid-20th century architecture in Britain, a scene, as we all know, highly dominated by rationalist functionalism. She arrived in London with her first husband, Ilya Zenghelis, who studied at the Architectural Association during 1950s. It was at this moment that her world of painting and his world of architecture collided, grew together, and soon became one. In 1972, their collaboration materialized through the project famously known as Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, which they developed together with Rem Koolhaas and Madeleine Friesendorp as an entry for the competition held by Casabella magazine titled The City as a Significant Environment. This was in fact the first official project by the four founding members of the group that three years later would become known as Office for Metropolitan Architecture, or OMA. Although the role of painting was minimal within Exodus, it was through their next projects, specifically the City of Captive Globe from 1972 and the Egg of Columbus Center from 1973, that Zenghelis found her sense of liberty within the group collective and dynamics. From this point forward, her work was integral to OMA projects until she ended her official collaboration with the office around 1986, after completing the paintings for the entry to the Parc Citroën competition in Paris in 1985. Zenghelis' separation from OMA did not, however, curtail her involvement with architecture. Since 1982, together with Madeleine Friesendorp, she was invited by the director of the AA, Alvin Boyarsky, to run color workshops at the school, a project that continued up until 1993. Their legacy made a seminal change in the way that architectural representation was taught at the AA, and reintroduced painting as a mode of thinking about the space, light, color, and proportion. A fundamental shift in architectural education that also spread and became more fashionable into other schools of architecture later on. Methodologies within the color workshop were informed by the ways in which Zenghelis and Friesendorf contributed to OMA projects. Students created collages using cutouts from magazines and paintings that together rendered line drawings in crayon, pencil, watercolor, and acrylics. We see here an exercise that they gave both ladies, Madeline and Zoe, gave to students, 3 different techniques of the same scene. Acrylic, watercolor, and colored pencil. The courses and workshops had been also so influential that ultimately changed the culture of architectural education at the AA and then globally. Just to make an example and to situate it within the context, it would be interesting also to know that even in famous Diploma Unit 9 studio that had been run by Ilya Zenghelis and Rem Koolhaas, and then followed up by Zaha in those years, most of the projects were represented and drawn and even designed in the fashion of black and white line drawings. That was basically the trend, and not only the trend, but also the method of thinking and design of the day. I will later go further into details of Zoe Zenghelis and Madeline Friesendorf's workshops between 82 and 93 in the presentation. The color workshop helped Zenghelis actually to rebuild a thematic and independent body of work following her departure from OMA. And her first large-scale solo exhibition actually was held at the AA again between January and February 1985. Called Zizi at the AA, this exhibition became a milestone in Zenghelis' artistic career and included more than 50 paintings that were exhibited in 3 different categories. The paintings that were based on OMA projects. Then the second group were a series of flat and geometrical paintings in acrylic and a series of atmospheric and melancholic spatial paintings in oil. As Kenneth Frampton stated in his review of the exhibition, he believes that this exhibition was a declaration of independence, a move to define her own position as a painter working with a certain affinity with architectural culture. In the same year as well, the AA Files, the journal of the school, published another review of the exhibition by the British art critic Joshua Reinhardt, described that Zenghelis' work as a theater of architecture, comparing her paintings to architecture of imaginary film sets, wherein all components of the scene carry a sense of direction, movement, and drama. These qualities could be also discussed in light of her trainings and education, but I will get to it in a few minutes. With this rather long introductory overview, we can now go perhaps deeper a bit into some aspects of Zoe's work and some examples. Every of the early, basically, projects created by Rem Koolhaas, Ilya Zenghelis, Madeline Friesendorf, and Zoe Zenghelis at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, these projects cannot be separated from their images. They are, in fact, visual manifestos. This was indeed celebrated in the first 2 exhibitions of the OMA works during 1978. Here we see the poster of the second exhibition at Guggenheim, where the 4 founding members and Zaha, of course, were almost equally represented, celebrated, acknowledged, and credited. But soon, these early OMA paintings have been relentlessly reproduced in magazines, books, digital media, and later online, and are invariably used as mere illustrations to be consumed by the public with no respect paid to their creators, original proportions, measurements, color tones, or even orientations. I have seen myself many of these paintings printed upside down. This condition has flattened, if not dismissed, the inherent meanings as both of these projects and work of art as both theoretical and technical documents. In the following, I will discuss the process of a couple of these projects in order to highlight the collaborative nature of the work and the role of Zenghelis in particular in these early projects. Zenghelis received her first lessons in painting in Greece as a teenager under famous Greek landscape painter Orestes Kanelis. When moved in London to London in mid-1950s, she first attended classes of interior design in the Regent Street Polytechnic, now is known as the University of Westminster. Then after a term or two, she changed to stage design. She expressed her dissatisfaction with the stage design also in a couple of interviews that she gave during the last couple of days, as she said that their tasks were quite boring since the professors didn't leave any rooms for the students for creative appropriation of the plays, costumes, or stage sets. And she famously said, and I quote, "They were sitting for hours in the B&A Museum and sketching Victorian furnitures and historical clothing and bored them to death." This was the time when Zenghelis changed her study once again and started a degree in painting at the same university. She worked and studied under the young but famous figures such as Leon Kossoff and Frank Auerbach. Although she claims that these painters' influence on her work were minimal, but we still can trace some common layers in color palettes or brush strokes within her early paintings, such as The Forest from 1987, that bears a resemblance to the work of Auerbach or Kossoff. But perhaps there is another fundamental common aspect, which is their sheer interest in the city and its tectonic structure as their frame of reference and as a subject of investigation. Soon, canvas became her stage and abstract shapes her protagonist. It is within such a period of her life that Zoe Zenghelis joined forces with her first husband, Ilya Zenghelis, Rem Koolhaas, and Madeleine Friesendorps in entering the world of architecture. And I quote her, "By painting for OMA, I became confident enough to become a painter in my own right." In summer of 1972, while all the four founding members of the OMA were still living in London, Koolhaas ran a summer workshop at the Architectural Association on the architecture of Manhattan. The ambitions of this research were clearly represented by a visual manifesto which served as a brief for the workshop, a painting drawn in the fashion of popular 1950s and 60s New York city guides, accompanied by a short text written by Koolhaas. Its central concept was straightforward: the city as a carpet of different ideologies. This painting would become then the first iteration of the City of the Captive Globe series that appeared on the poster of OMA's first exhibition, as we see in this slide, in the Stadtschule Frankfurt in June 1978. Similar to other paintings of OMA, neither Koolhaas nor Ilya Zenghelis had any role in the making of the final painting. As Ilya Zenghelis recalls, Rem sent us a pencil drawing that represented Manhattan as a three-dimensional grid of identical blocks, pedestals that carried modern architecture's most iconic buildings. Zoe decided to turn it into a painting, to color this drawing, painting the blocks as granite plinth, while giving distinctive colors to the hosted building on top of each. She then sent the drawing back to Rem and instantly received a thread reply: "I sent you a rough sketch and I received a masterpiece back." This was the City of the Captive Globe realized. She in fact did not paint one. She made at least 4 or 5 in some records of the City of the Captive Globe painting. And simply it was for the economic reason that the office, OMA, young OMA, in those years were living financially out of the sale revenues of the paintings. At least, and this went on at least for the first 10 years, for the first decades of the OMA. Each version is slightly different in color palette and details of the building. And Zoe took her liberty to play and to extend and to develop these initial ideas by Koolhaas and then later Ilya Zenghelis further into a project of her own. And this approach actually continued in other projects as well. Still, till today, the original paintings were being credited mostly, and sadly, only to Koolhaas, or sometimes, in some instances, to Koolhaas and Friesendorf. Beyond the major problem of editing out these women's name and their arts from the dominant narratives of architectural history and criticism today, there has been also another layer of lousiness, if we can name it, in any discussion around these projects. As it was in the case of the City of the Captive Globe, there are multiple versions of all the early OMA projects. Each has its own unique color palettes, details, compositions, and dimensions. And however, they all are regarded and treated as one and simply reproduced in the most disrespectful manner. And I would argue that us, architects, academics, historians, and scholars are the most guilty one here. The last one, the last painting, the one in the slides now, is actually painted by Madeleine, repainting Zoe's painting in 1994 as a night vision. This was, in fact, only one example to show how these projects are systematically misrepresented. And the same story goes with other early projects such as Hotel Sphinx, Roosevelt Island Housing, or paintings of Zenghelis' house in Kratikos. The details of each of these projects are discussed extensively in different papers, presentations, and a book that's just recently out. I must also mention that a typical process of painting of any of these early projects would have been like a brainstorming session between the four members, and then Ilya, mostly Ilya and Rem, bring out the main architectural concept that is a response to the brief of the competitions or the requirement of the client, bringing mostly historical precedents. And this discussion usually happens over the phone, by letters, fax messages, and telegraphs, depending where these four members are, which usually were divided for most of that early 10 years, the first decades, they were divided between London and New York. And depending on each project, either Ilya or Rem would take the lead. Here we are seeing, for example, one of the first sketches of the famous Hotel Sphinx project in 1974. These group discussions on the images and references and visual references and sketching organizational plans, mostly by Ilya, is then handed over to, is done in a kind of scale of, smaller scale of a kind of A3 or A4 sketches or doodling or axonometric drawing, usually pencil or ink. And then it's handed over to Zoe to test a couple of, let's say, qualities, and to even develop it further into a series of color schemes and give it an atmospheric and life and tectonic life even. If the work requires to be painted in a large size, they would then ask the collaborators to blow up the drawings into a scale of a 0 or even larger in some of the paintings that you might know. And then Zoe starts working mostly on those large canvases that is kind of made out of these kind of blown up drawings and sketches. Then Zenghelis then would take her liberty to interpret, add, remove, and in other words, turn the scheme into a project. Here we are seeing the process and different variations of what we know as the final painting of Hotel Sphinx, usually credited to the OMA 1975. We see that how she changes different and designs different plinth, different details of the neck of the Sphinx, different forms of the entrances, of course, experimentation with colors as well and proportions. As Ilya Zenghelis again wrote and emphasized, it was not a rendering, it was a transformation that gave the composition a renewed momentum. Through this fresh impetus, Zoe managed to invest the OMA projects that includes her paintings with a beauty and a level of excellence that bears her mark, a quality that is singularly manifest in her work up until today. There are, of course, stories, detailed stories about every and each of these projects, and I'd rather skip them, otherwise we will end up staying here for hours. Between 1972 and 1982, there was, in fact, an exceptional synergy and trust between the four founding members, as well as the other collaborators, which allowed each member of the team to inserting their expertise, their own expertise, skills, and craft, and merge them into the project, into the making of the project. At the same time, due to such complex and multi-layered collaborative processes, the input and the role of each individual involved is somehow lost in the history, or at least misrecorded in favor of a particular narrative or some particular narratives. But if we look at these through an art historical lens, while the final paintings have been considered as an outcome of a collaborative and creative processes, they should be read as an independent artwork and credited to the specific artists who executed the work through their creative and skillful authorship. And that's one of the reasons that this investigation pays a particular attention to these paintings as an independent work of art, whose properties should be defined within its technical, disciplinary, and creative framework. Even if we look at these paintings as technical architectural documents, as they were, again, we find ourselves in a careless and somehow ignorant approach to these materials when we see how such rich documents are reduced to images that are cropped, distorted, or how inappropriately represented, read, or referred to somehow. By that, I would like to arrive to some of OMA's post-1978 projects, wherein Zoe's had the central role, basically. A very fundamental shift in this period is that OMA's take on landscape projects, and in particular, a group of projects that were mostly coordinated and managed by Zenghelis and what was called the Greek OMA, which were mostly active with the Paris project or the Greek projects. Referring back to what we just talked about, namely painting is a technical document, we can review these exceptional group of projects. For example, this one, the project is one of the most iconic OMA landscape painting by Zoe. She made it for the project called Sant Gerasimos Sacred Path in Kefalonia Island in 1984. The project itself is a design for temporary infrastructure and short-stay accommodation along a sacred path where every August a procession happens between the village and St. Gerasimos Church and Monastery. Zoe decided actually to ignore all what is designed by the team and just painted the landscape, as we saw in the previous slides. So for her, the beauty, the importance, and the sacredness was presented by these planted and bushy mountains and the shades of gray and blue and greens, which kind of creates this beautiful scene. Zoe developed the same approach in making also some of the plans for this project. And in particular, the project that is called Hotel Terma, or 1,000 Olive Trees, which is perhaps the first project that she experimented with painting a plan, architectural plan. In this painting, which is rather large, there is a delicate balance between very well measured building topography, landscape infrastructure, and an impression of a seaside bushy hill in Greek island of Lesbos. The project was a design for a seaside resort and a marina, as well as seasonal accommodation for hunters on the uphill and a hotel. The landscape was covered with olive trees, and that's where the name of the project comes from. And in other paintings of this project, like the one that we're seeing here, the sketch and the preparation of the painting, Zoe literally painted 1,000 olive trees as the main element of the landscape and the project itself. In fact, interestingly for her, the landscape itself, again, was the project and not the proposed building. Here we see some of the variations that she tested different and experimented with different techniques. Here is acrylic, and in this one, she used oil. Zenghelis perfected her take on the plan paintings, perhaps in the project called 16 Villas in Antiparos, whereas the previous project that we talked about, the City of the Captive Globe, was OMA's manifesto for metropolitan architecture. The 16 villas designed in a hilly landscape in Antiparos Island became their landscape statement, and inverted Arcadia, as it was called by Ilya Zenghelis a few years later. Interestingly, both projects were generated out of two sets of paintings by Zoe Zenghelis, whose artistic practice found liberty and was expressed boldly in these two projects and paintings. This project in particular shaped the basis for OMA's famous submission for Parc de la Villette competition. As it is widely covered in multiple publications, the first phase of the competition was developed by the so-called Greek team, and the second phase by the Dutch fraction of the office. Zoe was present and had a central role in throughout the both phases of the competition. Her painting, the one that we're seeing on the screen, beautifully distills all the layers of the project into one visual manifesto. It is in this project that she develops a tectonic representation of the landscape features, and not as mere simplification of forms, but rather as a precise and well-studied, and at the same time, a creative interpretation of changing nature of vegetation and plants and their relationship with fixed architectural structures. The large rose slab represented here as dense pine trees, while the floating disc painted in dark green indicates a cedar forest planted at the center of the park. And then the other blocks, light green blocks, they're kind of rose bushes that are actually surrealistically painted not in rose, but in green. She later expressed her frustration with the density of the design elements in this project. And a year later, in 1983, she painted her own version of the project, and she called it Cassata. She said, the site was so congested, full of programs, gardens, and facilities. I cleared it from all these files. I only kept a few elements that I liked from the project, and I painted this carpet of light colors, highlighted with little kiosks and confettis. The two paintings actually marks a turning point in Zenghelis' artistic career. She began distancing a bit from the hectic office charrettes, and spent some time on developing series of independent paintings that are nevertheless inspired by city and its architecture, but also unapologetically they're personal. In these paintings, we can trace affinities with both surrealist paintings as well as the constructivist. The space turns to light and shades, and all together creates a theatrical scene whose allure lies partly in its vague sense of familiarity, and at the same time, estrangement. In this painting named Shapes in Space from 1992, shadows appear to fall in multiple directions, and perhaps we can find some vague similarities between Dali's dream scenes in Hitchcock's Spellbound movie from 1945 and the paintings. Dark, exaggerated shadows, curved planes, and scaleless forms in frozen time. The frozen movement in these paintings are actually reanimated by taking the audience into the scene. Solid shapes melt in the air, and the mist crystallizes into shards in a perpetual process. Gaze is invited to leave the frame and to follow the lines as they collapse into off-balance grid of color and jagged forms. As if the scenes are set in motion, dragging the observer into the world of amorous mania and hopeful melancholia. Of course, having this painting, Walking City, on the slide, I should mention that the influence that Zoe Zenghelis had on Zaha Hadid's works. It was actually Zaha that first invited Zoe and Madeline to run a crash course of color experimentation for her first year students at the AA. And according to Zoe and Zaha, Zaha was unsure about the use of color at the time and was influenced by OMA's works. And the workshop went so well that, as we just mentioned, the school director, Albin Boyarsky, asked both ladies, Madeline and Zoe, to teach the course permanently for the entire school. At the time, even most of Zaha's projects were ink drawings. However, in the same year, she decided to participate in the famous Peak Leisure Club competition in Hong Kong. And as we know, an epic entry by Zaha won the first prize. The Peak in 1983 soon turned into an iconic painterly style of Zaha Hadid's works. In order to finish these rather large paintings, the one that you're seeing in this slide, Zaha asked Zoe to help her, and the mountain was painted and the landscape was painted by Zoe. And it's not surprising that it's not that similar with the color palette that Zoe uses. And later on in Zaha's career, her color palette turned mostly into more vivid color with yellow accents and red highlights. It also comfortably fits within a series of paintings that Zoe was developing and is still developing in such, let's say, constructivist, let's say, collision and formal experimentation. During more than 60 years of practice, Zoe Zenghelis has developed a unique artistic career that is not only contributed to the tradition of modernist painting, but also, and I dare to say, has revolutionized the discipline of architecture. Her fundamental role in foundation of OMA and their project in the first 10, 12, 15 years, and her independent paintings, as well as her teaching altogether, created a culture that thinks, sees, and designs space through colors. Her own distinct color palette, not only in OMA projects, but most vividly presented in her independent works, has become an inseparable part of art and architectural history these days. During the last 3-4 years, and some of the outcome of this long research and collaboration with Zoe was exhibited in London and the US. Each exhibition had a particular message and focused on different aspects of Zenghelis' career. Here we see, for example, an installation shot at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, where we emphasize on the collaborative nature of her work, working as teacher and practitioner together with the co-curator of the exhibition, Theodosis Zayas. The extensive summary of the entire research is recently published in a book, which is just out, published by the AA, which was also mentioned in the introduction of the session. The publication actually attempts to trace the development of Zenghelis' artistic career through her paintings, her projects, and her teaching. And Zenghelis' personal archive, consisting of paintings, preparatory drawings, sketches, notes, letters, and photographs, has been the primary source of information for building up this research, together with the interviews and numerous chats and discussions with collaborators and friends. In fact, the project tries to shed a new light to these lesser known aspects of Zenghelis' career and how they kind of underlaid a foundation for what is for us today is almost a common sense, to use color, shades, and painting as a form of architectural representation. But there, looking back and see them how fundamental they were in not only representation of architecture, but into the design and thinking and seeing the space independently. By that, I will stop here. I will leave the floor to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamed. Such incredible insights and very thought-provoking, dense research that has really helped highlight and clarify several things about her practice. And I'm curious about the play. You mentioned a couple of times about a kind of a melancholic take and the creation of a fantastical or a fantasy, perhaps dreamlike scape, and the color palette and the abstraction support that direction. Can you elaborate maybe a little bit what triggers that? Even the title of the book also kind of I think has that melancholic taste. Can you elaborate a little on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, this is a kind of my personal reflection on who Zoe Zenghelis is and how she works and how she's been working and develops her career. The references that influence her, the way that she always discusses human emotions expressed into form, relates the painting back to some experimentation in the world of art, which are nevertheless inseparable from practices of surrealist and some sort of also early practices by Dadaist movement. So her affiliation, although in the kind of architectural side of reading early Oyme's work and also including Zenghelis' painting as central part of those work, has been always from architect side associated with the constructivist and somehow even deconstructivist during 1980s, 1990s. But the way that she reads it herself is much more inclined with the work of surrealists. I mean, the painters like Magritte, René Magritte and De Chirico have a central role in understanding of how the space is seen, read, and constantly in a constantly changing way. It's not an static moment of a fixed element. All these paintings have time, movement included in the way they represent or they project a reality. And also, I would say, this is my own interpretation, that her training as some sort of stage designer contributes to this kind of reading of a space as something that sets the space in motion and animates not only the actors or the protagonists, but the observant, the viewer, the visitors of the paintings. So this is a kind of goes hand in hand with how she reads her own work, and together with my own interpretation on how, through a kind of a longue durée of the development of the work and putting in the context of how she's been trained as a stage designer, and her early work contributes hand in hand together with the way that she sees the reality, or she sees a landscape, she sees an architectural project. Another example of that is, which I passed through quite quickly in the presentation, was the Oyme landscape projects, most of them unrealized due to the nature of the larger scale and nature of the projects, and most of them were tied into master plans, which nevertheless means the politics of the time. But at the same time, for Zoe, the way that those projects were perceived, received, and reprojected back and represented was through purely changing nature, changing landscape. And that's why the architectural elements of those proposals were quite hidden in the paintings. And it's the shadows, and shadows are quite surrealistic because she sees them in time, not a kind of captured moment. It's a season that she's painting with rather than a shot. So in a way, that's why we have, if we look at it as a static scene, we come across contradictions. This is not that very unsimilar with the ways, for example, how Dali or Magritte discuss their own way of looking at a scene. And going back to the last part of your question about the title of the book and the project, is actually a kind of ironic take on the first, a kind of very beautiful and heart-melting piece of archival document that I found during the research, which is the first postcard that Rem Koolhaas and Madeleine Friesendorf sends back to Zoe and Ilya when they go off board of the ship in New York. So they buy this kind of very cheesy postcards, which shows two couples holding each other in a sunset, and underneath is printed, "Do you remember how perfect everything was?" And this is the first letter that they sent back to Ilya and Zoe, expressing how terribly they miss each other.
That's beautiful. Such a great story. I'm curious, just a quick follow-up on this. I mean, the theatricality and the background in stitch design certainly come across in the paintings. And I'm curious, have there actually been proposals for set designs?
There have been. I mean, that one of the paintings that I showed was a set design, I guess, for a King Lear play. But as I mean, in my discussion, I always kind of with Zoe, we always concluded with this sentence that back then in late 50s and early 60s, the job of the set designer was to reflect back on the very firm pillars of theaters and dramatic, let's say, literature, rather than interpreting them into a new avant-garde, let's say, take, at least in her school. So that's why she was very bored of working on these kind of very epic plays and working with the costumes, etc. She wanted more liberty, basically. That's why the world of painting kind of liberated her from those constraints. Though I must say her affinities with movement and motion and drama is kind of embedded within the paintings that she does it today.
Thank you so much, Hamed, for your presentation. As you began introducing Zoe Zenghelis' work, you spoke on the fact that in many occasions her work and art was commodified, it was uncredited, or it was misunderstood, which I understand you aim to revise through your research and your writing. And I couldn't help but think of your contribution to the 21st edition of Sir Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture, because I'm pretty sure it was the first time it was fully printed in color, which is no coincidence in terms of articulating or adding on to missed or unrepresented histories. So I was wondering if maybe you could speak on how in your research, in Zoe's work, but also in general, how maybe you drew lessons from color or color revealed something that otherwise would have gone unnoticed.
It's, of course, I mean, this is a very good question, and also it shapes one of the core concerns of my own practice, which is how to, if we speak about, let's say, empowering specific groups, if we think about decolonization, if we think about, let's say, consciousness, bringing in new consciousness to our profession in different ways, what are the ways that we have as architects, practitioners, and academic agencies to do that? Of course, we can talk about these things as with the agency of a citizen, which is agency of a civic member, but how our own profession gives us new tools and new possibilities in order to be much more sharper and much more influential in the way these projects are intended to. So one of the, it's also interesting that you mentioned Sir Bannister Fletcher's 21st edition, because historically, that history book is known through its colonial look to architecture. It's a mid-19th century, started in mid-19th century, with a specific Eurocentric, not only that, but a UK-centric view of architecture of the world. And the editors of the recent publication edition basically aim to revise that and revolutionize that by bringing, first of all, expanding it, and also inviting specialists from different regions, different less known and less represented architecture of time to contribute. And that's why the cohort is much more diverse, and also the size and the ways in which, and the editorial, let's say, projects behind it and the curatorial projects behind it leaves room for, let's say, kind of at least precise and respectful representation of what those architectures are in their own limited scope of a book. Of course, we cannot aim higher than that. So in the research about Zoe's, my initial motivation, which comes out of frustration as a student of architecture three decades ago, actually, was that you know these buildings, you know these paintings, you know you're inspired by them, but then you come across the image rather than the project. You come across the flatness of the image as it's been reproduced, as it's been distorted, as it's been recirculated and manipulated, of course, through different medias. I'm not saying that the media here is the ways in which everything goes wrong, but I think it contributes through its kind of circularity, let's say the high circulation rate and speed. It leaves a bit of clumsiness and lousiness for whom that are not searching for the precise, let's say, information, if you like. So a bit of, let's say, I would say intentional process of editing out the role of artists in favor of architects in the history that we talk about by the readers, by the university professors, by the fellow architects, as well as the ways in which these projects are known, these projects that are mostly unrealized are known through the images, and the images equalize themselves with the figures, architects' figures. So, you know, all together, hand in hand, kind of resulted into the absence of the artist here, or actually by choice or by force. And this is the other, let's say, the way that in which I tried to counter that was to, first of all, I don't, in the book that is just out, I had to find, first, it's a kind of almost archaeological expedition. So I wanted to find the six and see the 6 different Hotel Sphinx and find out why they're different, what is different. So in an image of Hotel Sphinx that for me as 20 years ago was one image and one project, then knowing that it's 6 image and many other, let's say, interpretation and iterations and projects was the first entry point to know what they are, how different they are, and then how Zoe took this liberty to produce different things. They are not the same, they're different projects. They actually express different idea about the fundamental answers to the client's request or the competition's brief. And this kind of celebrating the diversity through a bit of, let's say, meticulous referencing to archival material was a kind of a tool for safeguarding, let's say, the legacy and that part of history. Not only that, I had this pleasure of living in the same city that Zoe lives, and talking to her and cross-checking her memories with other collaborators, and, let's say, collecting these oral histories that in a way gives another view on the collaborative nature of the design, and how, of course, ideas were generated collaboratively, and how different let's say, members of the group, no matter within the architectural office or different projects in the teaching project, in the pedagogical projects, took different individual tasks and developed their project at their own end, work hand in hand together, and how complex these processes are, first for myself to understand it, and then to reflect on it through, and that's, again, thanks to archival material, because they show the process. Rather than only the outcome and the results. And also, the last point that you mentioned, and I forgot to reflect on, is the actual color, because the most difficult part of the book was to cross-check every color that is produced with Zoe. She went to the archive saying that I never bought, when I showed the check print, she said that I never bought this yellow. I hate this yellow. I use, I don't know, daffodil yellow. And then we had, of course, everything needs to be calibrated again in the print house to reproduce the exact amount of, exact type of color that she originally used and basically thought and saw the work through it.
That's so fun that she had such a specific take on some of those colors like that, and that you've encountered a lot of that in your research with showcasing a lot of her work and the representation that can be so important down to that finest detail. I have a question that I want to bring up from one of our attendees who says, thank you, Hamed. You've mentioned her departure of OMA as a declaration of independence. Was her departure in order to become an independent artist or independent from her OMA team members or their commercial interest or other / additional reasons?
Is always other / additional reasons, always the case. So the departure at that time is a mixture of, because we are dealing with a very dense and intense group of collaborators and partners at the same time, life partners. So let's say life experiences spills out into the work experiences spills out into life. So that departure point is kind of fueled with various forms of, let's say, direction that the office took at the time. So again, splitting office accord based on the projects that we're receiving, mostly at the time from the Netherlands. So in a way, the office was more invested on in the Dutch, let's say, context rather than London or Athens. So this kind of took her away physically from being present in as a center person in the office, while previously most of the jobs were done in London. So although the projects were all around the world, but the actual production of the design and the paintings were done used to be done in London. So that's part of it, that in a way, because of the commissions and the ones that bring a realizable building into, let's say, the perspective of the profession, the office inclined towards the Dutch scene, and therefore she was removed. And also separation from Ilya Zenghelis was also during those years, which at the same time makes, although there were overlaps for a couple of years, that she kept collaborating with OMA till the end of Park Citroën project. But at the same time, those two forces specifically, and also having two children that they were at the time to be taken care of by Zoe mostly, and they, in a way, spending a bit of time with the children, were at least three different main let's say, forces that shaped, I guess, in my understanding, shaped the reasons for that departure.
Can I ask one more question about her teaching? Do you, from your research, maybe have some tips or could share any quick exercise or thought experiments or anything that can help our residents to how to think about color? I noticed in the exercise that you showed there were different experiments with different media, same scene, but different ways to represent. What maybe, what tips would you give us?
One of the most interesting actually exercises were done. I think I can share back probably one slide if you don't mind. Let's find it first. How can I share? No. That's technical.
No worries, you can go ahead and share it.
This one. Yeah. Can you see this one?
That was great to see in scale, understand how large it is.
Is it full screen? No, I think not.
It's not full screen yet.
It should be. Now it's full screen. So this, first of all, this is an exercise that reminds us a lot, perhaps, the city of the captive globe, but as a structure. So a kind of uniform grid or plinth that can host different ideologies, different monuments, different ideas. So this was a setup for the course. So each student has a plinth in order to build up a city or a metropolitan tectonic out. So each work that we see here is a collective panel, and she's proudly sitting in front of it just before the end of the year show on the terrace at the AA in 1989. So the details of some of these pieces, amazing pieces of architecture that are painted, and some of them are collaged, so you can see that, and some of them, they are just shades of color. So for example, the third, the bottom line, bottom row, the middle one is just series of, let's say, extruded cubes that is just experimented with and made out of different shades of red and blue and yellow. So in a way, the students had to think and design the space through and create tectonics by shades, not in a sense of looking at elements of shadow, shades, or color as a representation of an object, of a building, but actually using those qualities in order to create new realities. So that's why in many of the student works example, there is no sense of reality of, for example, if you look at direction of the shades and shadows, they keep changing. So that's reminds us many times in the work of Zoe herself, or the ways in which what the work captures is not one static moment in time, but is a duration of time, is a series of movement, is a story, or is a dream, perhaps. So I think all these kind of this series of projects that you're seeing on the slides, there are I think that, if I'm not wrong, at least 6 of them are printed in details in the book, but I'm afraid I don't have them ready in the slides, so it would be very difficult to find the best resolution right now to show the details of this amazing experimentation with the student. And I must also add that these were projects by the first-year students. So that fifth-year students, they come to Zoe and Madeline, and they develop their project together with them. So let me go back to another, which I didn't probably explain well. I haven't shared it. Sorry. This project is a project by students in 1983, Brian Marseille. This painting, which is longer than what I could capture in this slide, is almost, I think, 3 meters long. Is done by the student, by Brian himself, Zoe, Zaha, and Madeline. So 4 of them worked in this painting, and is a painting of a final project. So it was very usual that even the final project of a student is a collective work. And it shows how the collaborative nature of working at OMA, for example, has kind of extended and developed into the teaching methods of learning by doing. And here, and doing is collaborative. And we were lucky to exhibit this work in Carnegie Museum. And this was one of the central pieces. And amazingly, it was credited to 4 of them, although it is now owned as part of Brian's personal archive. But he proudly always presented it as a work of Zoe Zenghelis, Zaha, Madeline Friesendorf, and himself. Which, of course, you see how you will see a bit of Zaha in the kind of red hanging squares, and a bit of, let's say, Liszewski's Lenin Tribune, and also blue and shades of blue and gray is Zoe's color palettes, and a meticulous detailed painted in watercolor is basically Madeline's obsession with details and materiality.
Quickly, blue and gray palette how so? Is there any specifics about the palette?
For Zoe, it's very straightforward. Is Aegean landscape. So it's what she takes from Greece and her time and still she visits on every year, every summer. So it's the Mediterranean influence and the hills and the shades of the hills. So if it's not a flat landscape, therefore it's full of shades of the same color.
I can totally identify with that. Is there a work or maybe a period that you specifically like and or relate to?
It's very difficult to pick. I mean, I'm almost becoming obsessed. I started as a curious, and then I fell in love with the works more than before, and then I'm also I can some of them I just stare at them and they change. So there is one that I'm lucky to have, and it in different lights it's a literally a stage set, because the perspective keeps changing, because one thing that you see and associate as a shadow of a form then suddenly becomes a reflection in the other light, and then suddenly gives another dimension to the scene, gives another depth to the scene. So and vice versa. So then the shadow becomes the form, becomes a solid form. Then you will see it differently. So there is a kind of always a changing element within this kind of very complex yet simple tectonics that she represents her reality through.
Everything that you've shown us from Zoe's work has had so much energy and so much life in it. And I think expanding on that, just as you did now, is something great for the residents to think about too, as they're developing their ideas. They're designing a theoretical house for a poet in Rhinebeck. And so with all of these drawings that you've shown us today, I think just thinking about, and I'm curious if you have any last thoughts on this, Hamed, is like how to take these drawings that are mostly 2D, these drawings and paintings that have so much energy and so much life and that can change and have these shadow effects and reflective effects. How might somebody strategize that? How might the residents or anybody interested in bringing some of those things into the built environment? What can they do to translate some of these 2D drawings and paintings into something like models or built work, do you think?
By that, actually, I mean, the collaboration with that we mentioned had took different direction in pedagogical element and also profession of YMA projects. But what particularly Madeleine Friesendorf developed out of this collaboration is turning them into models. So recent work by Madeleine amazingly could be seen as models done out of Zoe's painting. So the ways that those kind of rooms are three-dimensionally made as chambers of curiosities or kind of little play sets, reinterprets and takes further this idea of animated, let's say, seemingly animated two-dimensional paintings into the actual space that can be inhabited or inhabitation could be imagined. So in a way, that's why still seeing them as a group that, although not intimately working together these days, but they still have this kind of distant yet associated methods of working that have the life of its own, and it's developing into different directions. So I suggest actually the ways in which those projects, the recent artworks by Madeleine has been developed, or at the same time, two of the collaborators, famous collaborators, Stefano Di Martino, which then led OMA Atelier for a while, and then he became Dean of Innsbruck University. Also, in his own way of drawing, because he's an architect and painter, he brings a new speciality to this kind of lineage of experimentation that could also be taken into account. and also a bit separate, not necessarily directly influenced, but yet being developed at the same time and together with Zoe, the work of Peter Wilson and John Sillett and Boles, who in a way reinterpreted all these kind of color palettes into the spatial tectonics, famously known at the beginning of 1990s as Follies, that very, let's say, popular in the practice of avant-garde architects of the time. So how those Follies as structures represented shades, elements, and tectonic, let's say, forms that had to be experimented and experienced through the architectural, let's say, inhabitation. So they are not in those experiments back in 90s experimentation, they are not yet developed enough to be inhabitable, but there are still sculptural and spatial elements representing something that we just discussed today, or taking it further to another direction, something that we discussed today that was the ethos of the time. But I don't see them necessarily as one lineage. There are different, let's say, branches of basically a pool of ideas and creative people that were working remotely or very closely together, some of them.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that helps everyone here attending the webinar and the residents too, as they continue to develop their projects. And Hamed, we would love to have you on the final review if you'd like to be there for that and see the work that they've done and the concepts they've been exploring.
Thank you. I think it's a bit, I have to take a flight and go to holidays finally, but sadly I will miss it, but I will closely follow it up. Hopefully it will be recorded, photographed, or later published, and I would be having a chance to review the works.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Hamed.
Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you so much, Hamed, and thank you to the residents
you.
and everyone in attendance.
Thank you.
And we're so happy you took time out of your day to be with us here, and appreciate everything you've shown us and hope to stay in touch.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.